Welcome. I'm Eugene Scott. I'm a journalist covering politics and a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics and a host at Axios Live, and I'm going to be your moderator today. So we just have 2 more weeks until Election Day, and anxiety over the presidential election is at a fever pitch. And psychologists are now referring to political anxiety as a distinct condition. And today we'll have a chance to talk with our awesome panel here about political engagement in the election and how it's affecting people's health. And I just want to give you an idea of who we're talking to, these great minds here. First, we've got Della Volpe. He's a director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School of Institute of Politics. Kirsten Soltis Anderson, she's a pollster, a commentator, and founding partner of Echelon Insights. Danielle Allen, James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard University and director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. And Chanyasulkit, immediate past president of the American Public Health Association. So first, I want to reference a poll from the American University Science Institute and Generation Lab shared exclusively with Axios today, which you should be reading. The top emotions young people feel about the election are nervous and scared. A February Pew poll found that more than half of the adults in the U.S. feel exhausted and angry when they think about politics, with only 10% reporting feeling hopeful. John, in your role at the IOP, you help lead the Harvard IOP Youth Poll. I've talked to you and students about what you've been able to produce, and I know you got some good stuff coming out pretty soon, good depending on where you fall on the political spectrum. You've been talking to students, and you all have been collecting data on young Americans' political opinion since like 2000. What stands out to you about this particular moment?
Thanks, and thanks for hosting me in this important discussion. And I think that you're right. Young people today feel like this insecurity and instability about the future. They feel like all of the problems that older generations are trickling down to them, and they feel like this significant responsibility to have a position, to argue each side, and to participate in that. And that is incredibly stressful. That's kind of one thing that I hear quite a bit. 2/3 to 3/4 have little hope that the current system can actually solve the challenges that they face. And it's something that is of deep concern. We also have seen an increasing level of younger people indicating that several days of the last couple of weeks, they have feelings of hopelessness and depression, anxiety, oftentimes related to politics, whether it's the state of our discourse, whether it's political instability, economic insecurity, or the overall concern about what's happening around the world. So there's deep anxiety, and the degree to which people can see the hopefulness in politics, can see the degree to which tangible differences can be made, those people are much more likely to vote and participate in the next couple of weeks.
Kirsten, you speak with focus groups quite a bit, I believe like yesterday even. What's something you're hearing that you feel is missing from the media conversation that people aren't talking about enough?
Well, I feel like when it comes to voters' feelings of frustration and anxiety and exhaustion with this election, a big undercurrent I feel from people is that they feel in some ways powerless, that they feel like the government has so much power now that therefore who is in charge of it can have really significant consequences for their own life personally. And this is something that has changed in polling over many decades. There was some public-facing polling that I took a look at that went back to the 80s. And people were asked questions about, how much does it affect your life personally? Who wins the election or who's running the government? And back in the 80s, it's like 30% of people would say, yeah, who runs the government has a big effect on my life personally. And that number has shot through the roof. And so because people are now they're engaging with government for more things like how to pay for college, how to get health care, et cetera. Who is in charge of that, or who is in charge of protecting rights, rolling back rights, those sorts of things, it just feels like the stakes are very high. And at the same time, people feel powerless. They feel like those who wish to do them harm have been increasing in their power and ability to harm them. And that's led some people, particularly those who are consuming the most information about politics, to feel the most anxious.
So this anxiety that Kristen just mentioned, Chris, I think a lot of people would view it as individual, but it's actually a public health issue. And can you talk about why it's not just something that's happening in people's heads?
So first off, everything is public health, right? It's health in all policies. I have to always say that. So yes, unfortunately, political anxiety is, a huge effect on your mental health right now. But in general, mental health is so important to your physical and overall health and wellness anyways, and then you can see there are studies that show that, for example, if you suffer from depression, you'll have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. A lot of studies show that, if you have high depression anxiety, you might end up using substance misuse and alcohol more. So it's all very much related. And so there's also a lot of research coming out from here as well at Harvard about how voting and elections are a real determinant of health. If you look at communities that vote more, they are more inclusive, they are healthier, they have better health outcomes when they vote more. So we have to take that evidence-based research and really recognize that our mental health on a community level is a public health issue, and it matters so much. I mean, and not just because there's political anxiety. I mean, there's anxiety about everything right now. We just had 2 hurricanes. Climate change is a public health issue. And people have so much uncertainty and anxiety. But then you couple that with, we're also dealing with the effects of the COVID pandemic. And then our lack of mental health services or access to it. And or if you do find someone, you're very unlikely to find a mental health provider who in any way looks like you or has your same cultural or ethnic background. So you couple all of that, and yes, this is a public health crisis.
As an American, I'm anxious as well, but as a fellow with the IOP, I'm mostly encouraged and inspired, and I don't know if that's just the nature of the students. I think it largely is. And Danielle, I want you to talk a bit about what are some of the good parts about being engaged politically, the positive effects they have on our mental health and our physical health and well-being.
Well, thank you for that question, Eugene, and for this conversation. Without any doubt, empowerment is good for people's health. It's good for their mental health, it's good for their physical health. Many of us probably know that from stories in our own lives. In my own case, my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in northern Florida in the 40s. That was a very dangerous time. Lynchings were on the rise. So without any question, it's a sort of period that would have been very provoking of anxiety, for instance. Yet he was always a person of incredible self-confidence, incredible ability to navigate the world. And as a young person watching him, it was very clear to me that his civic engagement, his connection with others in order to shape his community, that was a key source of his empowerment. And in fact, the data supports that. When you look, as you were saying, at voting, folks who vote do have better mental health and better health outcomes generally. The same is true for other kinds of political engagement as well, although there's an important thing to say about this. When young people in particular are massively engaged across sort of all dimensions, so not just voting, but also, say, protesting and running for office and a whole load of things, they have negative mental health outcomes unless they are extremely well connected with a lot of other people.
Sure.
So in other words, there is this kind of tension between conflict and connection. And that really, I think, is at the core of the question of how we process political anxiety. Are we processing it in mainly a conflict mode, or are we taking the opportunity of engagement to connect with others and do positive work for our communities?
So reading news by yourself, not processing it with people in community is not good.
Correct.
No, that is, I've not done any research, but every article you read, you should share. It's what I got from that and talk to people about. But let's pivot to the media's role since we're here. We have survey results from September from the AP and the North Center for Public Affairs Research and USA Facts. And it shows 6 in 10 Americans feel they need to limit their political news consumption to avoid feeling overloaded or fatigued. And I make light of this quite a bit, but this is very serious. I have lots of thoughts about this because I've seen in my own friends and family some anxiety that folks would not have if they looked at a little less news. And social media is a big part of that news diet. More than half of U.S. adults say they at least sometimes get news from social media like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok for the younger generation. Kirsten, what are you noticing about how Americans are getting their political news? And how might that affect how they feel about the election? Like, are you seeing people be more anxious if they cater to certain outlets, or less anxious if they have a diverse media diet? What are you seeing?
So I believe that right now a big driver of the anxiety we are seeing is the ability to doom scroll. So if you think about the way somebody got news about, say, the election in 1996, the internet was still dial-up modems in people's homes. You were probably not sitting there streaming news directly to yourself all day. You were getting a newspaper, maybe you're watching the evening news.
You certainly weren't on your phone.
You certainly weren't on your phone. But a decade and a half later, you could have an ever-updating newspaper with you in your pocket at all times. Now, that in and of itself might not be so bad. Being able to be a little bit more updated might be okay. The problem is you're not getting that information from the equivalent of a newspaper that constantly updates itself. If you are getting it from social media, you are getting it in a way that is being served to you algorithmically based on what you engage with.
Got it.
And what people engage with is stuff that makes them feel, not always what makes them think. And it doesn't always make them feel good.
Right.
Good and bad emotions are still feelings that get you to click on something and get the algorithm to go, oh, Kristen likes that. Let's give her more of that. And so it's very easy to wind up consuming news from platforms that, maybe not nefariously, probably with some kind of a profit motive for sure, but want you to be glued and therefore want you to feel as much as possible. And the more you feel, the more you click, and so on it goes. And I think that to me is the thing that is very troubling about the incentives in the media and tech environment that have fostered the ability to sit and doom scroll, which people did not have a decade and a half ago.
Yeah, no, Danielle, do you see any examples of how traditional social media are hurting or helping political anxiety?
It's definitely right at the center of the conversation.
Okay.
So when I talk about healthy democracy, and that's the phrase I use, and I think the health metaphor is very helpful for thinking about democracy, I always talk about there being three pillars to that. The right to vote, of course, sacrosanct, but to have that, you have to have competitive elections and contested elections, and that means we all have to be able to process that competition and that conflict. And then lastly, though, there also has to be a right to see and shape your community. Because if you can't actually control what elected officials are doing, if you can't hold them to account because you can't see what they're doing, then you don't have the whole sort of circuit of responsive government. And so I do think the fact that local news has fallen out from under us is one of the disempowering features of our current landscape, and one that makes people feel trapped. At this point, there's sort of lots of maps of news deserts around the country. We talk a lot about food deserts. News deserts are roughly the same kind of concept, that people are without the basic information they need to see what their city officials are doing, to see what their state officials are doing. And then in that vacuum, the only story they have is the national story, which is fueled by algorithms that make a profit from feeding outrage. Repeated outrage injections are not good for mental health. It's important that we don't have to have our media designed that way. There are actually people working, for example, on algorithms that are based on more bridging relationships. How do you forge connections and connect to viewpoints that are different from your own to sort of expand your horizons of the possible? We really could have a completely different media ecosystem, but it would be partly about those algorithms at the sort of national level, and then also rebuilding local news so that we actually have immediate control in our own communities in the first instance.
My background is in local news before I came to HKS, so I'm a big fan of knowing who your mayor is and who your school board folks are. And because of what you mentioned, the deserts, sometimes I feel like there are people in this country who are paying more attention to some elected official that's always on cable news than they are their own local, and anxious about something that may not even happen in their own community. And so that's a very valid point. John, you had an op-ed today in the New York Times. What role do you see the media being able to play in helping people understand or misunderstand, like polling and the work you work on?
Well, a couple things. I think the polling, I don't want to speak for Kristen, but the polling that I think we think of as most helpful to Americans isn't predicting what's going to happen in 2 weeks within a fraction of a point.
Sure.
Right? It's giving voice and understanding the reasons behind those particular numbers, right? So we started the Harvard poll 25 years ago because young people were voting at very low numbers. Only a third voted in 1996.
Okay.
And the idea of if we could elevate their voice and share the values and the issues that they were concerned about, then elected officials could reach out to them and civic participation would increase with this generation. I think that's a significant part of polling and public opinion. The question is, there's a lot of conversation happening now about the gender gap. There's a lot of conversation happening now about is Trump doing better or worse with certain subgroups, Hispanic American, Latino, African Americans. Only survey research or public opinion can explain why those are happening, right? So I think that's a part of the polling dialogue that is often missing. One of the reasons I think that in the piece that was published yesterday in the New York Times, we talked about this expanding gender gap, is that younger men in particular feel disconnected from the Democratic Party. Unless pollsters can identify those trends over time, then Democrats or Republicans can't really understand what's driving that and try to ameliorate that situation and increase levels of participation.
Chris, I know it's not a perfect science, but do you have any thoughts on what's a healthy media diet for someone? When do they know maybe this could be hurting my health personally and also maybe the health of the public?
So first, I am not a mental health therapist in any way, so, go see yours. But I will say it was a lot of what, Kirsten was saying, Danielle, doom scrolling. Do not go to bed at night with your phone and reading, right? Who does that? It's terrible. Do not wake up first thing in the morning and reach for your phone and see what's going on. None of that is good. Because you're getting inundated and you're getting that outrage that she's talking about. And that's so not healthy. And so a lot of what I was able to do over the year as APHA president was to tell my initiative of ways to make us a healthier democracy, happier folks who are more engaged, was to play, read, and vote for health. Because play, one, I think as a nation, we work really hard. We are all about productivity, but we don't take a moment to play, whether that's by ourselves learning to knit, which I can't do, or trying pickleball, or being in engagement with someone else, going for a walk, that whole conflict and connection. Do something with someone else. Or read. Don't just read the news. I love polls, and I think reading is obviously important, but does anyone read for pleasure and enjoyment? Anyone reading any books out there? Do you go to your public library? Let's support those. Do you, by the way, know that there are terrible issues of book banning that's happening in every state across our nation? So these are things where we need to read and see the other side, see other characters, dive into other stories and learn. And then voting, but what I loved, and I'm so thankful you talked about it, was the knowing local, right? I was telling people, yes, we need to vote in a couple of weeks, or vote now if you can vote early, but you want to vote local and all the time, right? In my town, we vote also in May. And those are where differences matter, because it's the zoning, which affects your affordable housing, for example, and your bike lanes and your trash getting picked up. So no matter what happens in 2 weeks, I am optimistic that this actually wakes people up to vote all the time, not just every 4 years. Because like you said, it's at the local level, which we saw in the pandemic, where the voting makes a difference in the lives of communities.
You speak about community and doing life with other people besides yourself, obviously. And something I think about a lot is how few of us are doing life with people not like ourselves. And this is a great opportunity to talk about polarization. There's a sense, obviously, that the media is largely responsible for driving more polarization. And there's truth to that. The Pew poll said 61% of U.S. adults find it stressful and frustrating to discuss politics with someone who holds a different view. That's an increase of about 11% from what it was in 2019. And I would love to hear some of your thoughts about what you think is behind this increased political animosity and what's the mental health fallout from that. And Kirsten, the root of polarization is feeling that the other side is out to get them. Is that fair? Is that what you're hearing when you're talking to folks?
So the best way to think about polarization is not that half of the country believes one thing and half the country believes the other thing and there's no agreement. In fact, whenever I've done surveys where I've asked people what their views are on public policy, we do an experiment every year where we ask 20 questions. 10 of them are about economic issues, 10 are about social and cultural issues, and we present a conservative point of view and a progressive point of view, and we say, which of those do you agree with more? And almost no one picks 20 out of 20 conservative or 20 out of 20 progressive, right? We're all a little more complex than that generally, and I think that's good. So people's traditional concept of polarization is that half the country believes one thing, half the country believes the other, and that's not true. But what is true is that we have a heightened threat response to people who we perceive as being on the other side. I heard this described by a friend who works in national security, foreign policy type issues. She said, the way we as a country decide if another country is a threat is, do they have the capability and the intention to harm us? So if you have a bunch of nuclear weapons, but you're our ally, I don't consider you a threat, you're my friend. Or if you're a country that says you don't like me, but you don't have any actual military might where you could hurt me, maybe I don't worry that much. But it's when you have both of those combined. And it's that powerlessness that makes it easier for people to have this threat response where they go, when I ask my Republican friends, do you feel like Republicans are powerful these days? They'll go, no, are you kidding me? Right. We can't agree as a party. We never fall in line. Look how many rounds it took us to elect a speaker. We have disagreements all the time. Democrats have, and they'll name all these big institutions. The media, they have the White House, they have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then you ask Democrats, do you feel like your side is in charge? And they will similarly say, are you kidding me? I wish we had a Mitch McConnell. They have the Supreme Court, they have gerrymandering. So both sides view the other side as way more powerful. And then they see their own side as weak, ridden with division, unable to get things done. And so because of that, if you feel powerless, you're more willing to, you feel more under siege. And the other fallout from that is you're more willing to excuse bad behavior or norm breaking on your own side, which leads to a further sort of spiraling. So for me, this empowerment is so important because that's one of the first ways to begin to bring down that threat response. If people no longer feel like their side is powerless and the other side is mean and evil and all powerful, and realize that it's a little more complex a story than that, that I think is an important way to feel less anxious.
And I would imagine not only do you feel defensive, some of these folks are more likely to be on the attack if they feel like their safety is at risk. Danielle, you talk a bit about the great pulling apart. Like, what is that? What does that mean? Can things get back together? Where are you with that?
Well, when I write about the great pulling apart, it's a lot of different dimensions, and I typically start in writing about that just talking about my own family story, where in my parents' generation, everybody moved up. My granddad was a fisherman, his kids were small business owners and professors, and on the other side from factory workers to accountants. But my generation lived through something different. So here I sit joining all these wonderful people, tenured faculty member at a great university. That's a position of incredible privilege. I've got a brother who's a corporate executive. But I also have cousins who aren't with us any longer. So kids I used to run around in the streets playing football with, that I grew up with. And we've lost them because of substance use disorder, because of incarceration, because of gun violence. And I realized at a certain point when I lost my youngest cousin that what my family had lived through with this sort of pulling apart between incredible opportunity for some and others being really trapped in difficult circumstances, our whole country has lived through that over the course of my lifetime. So my 50 plus years on this planet track the graphs that show us the rise of income inequality and wealth inequality, rise of incarceration, and also the rise of polarization, in fact. And so a lot of that story is about our political institutions not being responsive to real problems in people's lives. And then in a context where the institutions become less responsive, it's very easy to cast the blame on another side. Somebody's powerful. I'm not powerful. Somebody's powerful. So the blame lies over there. And for me, what that then really means is an important story. I want to sort of echo one of the points that Kirsten was making about where Americans actually are in terms of their basic opinions. I mean, there is actually amazing overlap and potential for agreement. And we see that especially in state ballot initiatives. So forget about national electoral politics for a moment and you look at states, And you see supermajorities consolidating around things like cannabis legalization, around in Mississippi getting rid of the Confederate icons on the state flag and replacing the iconography with forward-looking iconography. In Florida, restoring the right to vote to people who had completed service of their felony convictions. In the state Massachusetts, we had something called the right to repair, which gave small auto shop owners access to the data in cars so they could continue to compete with the large auto manufacturers. And if you look across all of those, and again, these are delivering supermajority votes, meaning more than 2/3 of people voted for them. That means they are cross-ideological coalitions that are forming around this, multiracial and cross-ideological. And there's some core values there, sticking up for the person getting the short end of the stick, basic fairness, sort of basic picture of opportunity and inclusion. So we, the people, do actually have that kind of center of gravity within us, but our electoral politics puts us in a trap where, because of mechanisms in the institutions, we do have relatively small portions of the electorate actually determining who our candidates are. So this is gerrymandering combined with our party primary system. But it has a result of meaning, just to take an example on either side, that Marjorie Taylor Greene is elected by 8% of the electorate in her home district, and AOC is elected by 5% of the electorate in her home district. So our elected officials are accountable to very small percentages of the electorate, not to the sort of bigger mass of the general public. And I think that's what ends up giving us a really polarized sort of national electoral conversation that I think of honestly as a trap. That is trapping the rest of us in the sort of complex, multifaceted ways that we exist from actually having the conversation we want to have about how to solve some of our shared problems.
That's really interesting. I wonder, Chris, if you've seen any data or been involved in any conversations about the impact on the well-being of just society as a whole of extreme partisanship. Like if that shows up in physical health and mental health and
Well, just as we were saying earlier, all of this anxiety and polarization, it's not healthy. It doesn't lead to a healthy democracy. And the research shows, that in places where people don't vote and they're not engaged, whether that's with their local news or just in an electioneering and campaigning, or just knowing who your, select board member is, those places that are not engaged, they are not healthy. And that's because the people are not engaged. They don't know what's going on. And then they're like drifting and doom scrolling and looking at the national news and not recognizing that there's that connection within that community that they need to have. And that's kind of what I guess I really want us to go back to is, yes, this is a terribly anxious time, but that we have this power, and to even think about maybe your voting as a form of self-care, to vote, to go out and vote, bring your friends and family, make a plan to vote as a form of self-care so that you can take your power back. But not just again, in November, but in every cycle, because I think once we do it and it becomes a habit, it's sort of like, going for a walk and you keep doing it, it becomes a habit, you'll get stronger and healthier. And I think that's what we really need, because we're not engaged as a democracy in many places and spaces for so many number of things because of our single member districts and all these other things that we could change. And that is a great discussion for another time, whether we should think about multiple choice, ranked voting and all these other things. There's so much out there that we could do, but I think the first part is, are people just in there voting? And that's my antidote right now is voting is your self-care, take care of us.
I want to stay with you for a bit, Chris, and then pivot over to John when we talk about political anxiety and youth. And we have polls, which we mentioned earlier, about young people feeling nervous and scared, experiencing high rates of anxiety and depression. There was a federal survey last year that found that half of adults 18 to 24 reported anxiety and depression symptoms. And, I've talked to family members. I've been on campuses. I'm really interested in speaking with you, Chris, because I think you mentioned having a high schooler or maybe a middle schooler. I can't remember. But I wonder if you all are seeing this anxiety go down below people who can vote. Like, are high schoolers anxious as they look at their parents and their elected officials stress out about where this country might be going?
So, so I got to travel the nation as APHA president, visiting largely a lot of universities and meeting with their students. And yeah, people are frustrated because they already had to deal as students with the ramifications and the mental health issues of being in COVID. And then now they're surrounded by people, and you have grades and student loans. And for a lot of students, there's a reason why there are now food pantries at many college campuses. I mean, it's just hard to be a college or a younger student today. And then you layer on the election, right? And so people are finding it to be really hard, in particular because all of this is everywhere, and it's on your college campuses. There are protests for any number of issues you could, and it's affecting the students who are protesting. Maybe they won't be able to graduate. It's affecting the faculty that's there, and then it's affecting us as folks. Danielle and I were talking. We both have a 9th grader, and I find that to be very stressful. But I do think, I find that to be very stressful. That's another talk. We'll do the anxiety of having a high schooler. But the thing is, all of these young folks, and just people in general, if you look at the research, for example, 2/3 of Americans want and recognize that climate change is a problem, and we want renewable resources, and we support it. Most Americans do believe that abortion should be legal in all instances. Many people do want protections for LGBTQ plus folks. And I think what's really hard is, in particular, if you aren't old enough to vote, it's really troubling because you're seeing a lot of these protections and possible things that will directly affect your life and your future, and you can't make that vote, right? And so I think that's really hard. Sure. Or for students in general, there's a time when they can't maybe donate to all of these PACs and things like that because they're dealing with their student loans, which, depending on how the election goes, could affect the ending of canceling debt on a lot of student loans. So I think we need to do totally what Danielle said, was just that connection. And I guess in so many ways, aside from having, a 9th grader, I would feel anxious all the time, but I think it's, I'm dealing kind of okay. Because, I work with and volunteer with the American Public Health Association. That's a beautiful 30,000 other people who care and are working all across the nation and globally. Right here in Massachusetts, there's the Massachusetts Public Health Association. I sort of think of it as misery loves company, but really it's getting together and sharing with other people. So you're not alone, and this isn't you doom scrolling by yourself. You need your friends to be there to text you those funny memes to get through the hard times, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I have found, and I have often shared that with students. And the students on the campuses who are activated and join and are engaged as a community, they are doing better. And then, of course, also we have to get rid of the whole stigma of mental health services and talk therapy and medication therapy. Like, there's just so much stigma around that. So people should be open and honest about that too.
That's great. No, it really is so many important thoughts there. And I want to pivot to John. I have previously made the mistake of using 18 to 24 synonymously with college students. Mm-hmm. And we know that does not, that doesn't line up. Right. And I think you talked about that a bit in your piece in the Times today, especially when it comes to young men. What are some anxieties of young people that are not in college, that aren't getting the attention that maybe we give to, college educated young people?
Yeah, thank you. So let's take one small step back and focus on Gen Z for a second, right? Mm-hmm. So it's essentially the 18, 24, 18, 27-year-old cohort of voters today. It goes all the way down to middle schoolers. But this is a generation who was born in late 1990s. They don't remember 9/11, mm-hmm. which means they don't remember September 12th and September 13th, when at least for a few moments, or a few weeks, or a few months, we kind of connected with each other as Americans. Regardless of whether you were in a red county or blue county, most of us, hung the flag mm-hmm. outside of our house. So this is a generation that I believe has seen more chaos more quickly before neuroscience tells us that the human brain is actually able to be mature in the mid-20s and to process this. Mm-hmm. Instead, when I speak to younger people, they talk about their first memories and experiences being of the Great Recession. And that is bringing nightmares back to today. I meet many people in my work who were homeless as children during the Great Recession, and 15 years later find themselves homeless again, despite being in college and despite sometimes having 2 or 3 different jobs, right? This a sense of insecurity, especially with young males, is something that they had since their earliest days. Enter elementary school, where too many young people have continued to have nightmares over the effects of school shooting and red alert school shooter drills. By the time they're in middle school or early high school years, they're going to far too many memorial services, wakes, and funerals because members of their community dealing with opioid crisis or death by suicide because of, right? Then you enter concerns about climate, concerns about polarization, all before we dealt with the thousands of hours that young people were in their rooms during COVID, right? All those times we hadn't seen America, young people at our best. And that's stressful. And that's why I think it's so important for this conversation, for all of us who've got a greater sense of experience, to remind younger people that things do get better. Things have gotten better. Because of young people, if you're a Democrat, because of young people, you've got the first African-American woman in the Supreme Court. Because of younger people, you have the first bipartisan gun legislation, couple generations. So connecting all of this, it's the fact that young people are stressed out, they're not watching as much traditional news, and they're missing the few good things that government has been able to accomplish over the last years, which continues this cycle of, I think, negativity and stress and anxiety.
To your points, I've written about identity politics quite a bit. It's something I am very interested in as someone who's covered politics across the country and different groups. What are some storylines, Kirsten, that you're seeing related to maybe faith or gender or sexual orientation or any of the different ways people identify that are interesting in this election, that are coming up in polling, that maybe people aren't thinking about?
Well, I think in this election there's just a lot of selling fear. And that even people who will say the other side is out there fear-mongering, then they turn around and they do it themselves. They catastrophize what the other side taking power would mean, in my view. I don't think that one side or the other winning means the end of the republic as we know it. And yet when you're out there, if you ask a Democratic voter, they will say, I feel like the world's gone mad and only voting out Trump will stop it. Because if he's in power, and they'll name 10 things that they think are horrible. And then I talk to a Trump voter in the next focus group, and they'll say, the world has gone mad, and only electing Donald Trump can stop the craziness. And then they'll read me 10 things that they think the world has gone crazy about, and that only having Donald Trump in charge will fix. And so it's that fear-driven a component that I then think bleeds into people's thoughts about their own identity and the way that government policy can intersect with that. So, you have a lot of voters who are voters of faith who have been very drawn to Donald Trump because they believe that only he will protect their religious freedoms. At the same time that you have a lot of voters of color, LGBTQ voters, who have said, Donald Trump would not protect my rights at all, and so I am therefore going to vote for the alternative. And so I do think that in this moment where it's not just about, it doesn't feel like we're just having debates about what the top marginal tax rate should be, but we're having this very fundamental debate about what does it look like for America to be sane again? That's, I think, so rather than just focusing on any one in particular group by identity, I think this is something that's pervasive throughout conversations with voters I have on the right and on the left.
Danielle, the idea of again is very interesting. It implies that America was once somewhere that is worth being celebrated and returned to. You've mentioned repeatedly your family history. You teach about history. What are you seeing as an academic that concerns you about what voters do or do not know or remember about this country's history?
Wow, that's a big question.
And you have 2 minutes.
Exactly. Well, that's a really beautiful question. It's funny. I'm going to do my best to answer it. So you started by making a comment about the word again, right, which we hear a lot of, and often people will then say, but did we ever have something that we wanted to 100% re-endorse? And then the answer will be no, for lots of obvious reasons about sort of history of racial domination and challenges with gender and things like that. So I do think it's important to recognize that we are just living in a time of incredible transformation. The global economy has been transforming. A lot of this is driven by technology. Technology has permitted the scaling up of human society so that we can sustain populations at scales that were previously unimaginable. Communications technology has transformed patterns of migration as well. So there's just a degree of mobility in the world that is unprecedented. And all of these things present governance challenges that our governance institutions created almost 250 years ago struggle to cope with. And so I talk a lot about renovation as being what we need. So not that we need sort of back again something that we had, but the idea that empowerment, that sort of core value, is worth having. It's worth having. And if that's worth having, then you've got to have a democracy. You've got to have a free society. And a free society is not something that sort of falls from heaven. It is something that people design and cultivate and build and practice. So this would be the thing I think I would want people to know from history, right? That it has always been a thing that has been designed and built and made and practiced and cultivated, all of its previous iterations, regardless of what we think about them. And so that sort of same work is our responsibility now. And it's a critical responsibility because in this world of incredible, again, transformation because of the global economy and technology, autocratic systems of government are actually proving themselves faster at adapting to contemporary conditions than systems of government that are free societies. So sort of we who live in constitutional democracies have an obligation, I believe, because again, I believe in empowerment, to understand, again, what it takes to design those practices of shared decision-making through institutions and figure out how are we going to renovate, redesign for contemporary circumstances where we're so much bigger, 330 million people, so much more diverse, where our district structure and gerrymandering no longer give us responsive institutions. They sort of paralyzed our decision-making and so forth. There's a lot of work to do. So yes, I do think understanding our own history is what prepares us to do the work for the future. But the work for the future is future-looking work. It's not. I mean, I think it's like, yes, we want to be sane. I'll say that for sure. Like, let's make America sane. I'm happy to go with that.
Put that on a hat.
Exactly.
That's good. Renovate and redesign. And I want to come back to Chris in closing. You mentioned something earlier: play, read, and vote.
Yes.
Right. And so that, I think, is a strategy you talked about a bit that can swing us a bit from political anxiety to maybe like engagement, maybe hopefulness.
Absolutely. So I love things in threes. I have 3 kids. I can really only remember 3 things. So it's to play, read, and vote, because truly, as a society, we in America especially, we are work, 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 work. And a lot of that is because of the systems. But take a moment for yourself, whether it is to, color or go for a walk or just talk with someone or sit outside and see the beauty that is there in front of us right now. Right? Take a moment. And in particular, it'd be great if you played with someone else. I've heard pickleball is great. I've tried it. I am not very good at it. Or then to read. Again, we need to read and read your history so you know what's going on. Don't let other people censor your books. Read any and everything you can. Support your public libraries. And then also just read for enjoyment. Dive into a whole nother world if you want, right? Graphic novels, sci-fi, there's so much out there. Take that moment to read, but also don't forget to do your critical reading because we have to combat, as a nation, misinformation and disinformation. So I really want to get people back to just that reading and critical thinking. And then voting. That is my remedy for your self-care, for this anxiety, is to vote, again, now, but vote in all the elections. Go home and find out who are your local elected officials. Who is on your zoning board? Because they are critical to so much of where you live. For example, do you know who they are? Do you have a mayor? Do you have an alderman? Do you have a council person? Who do you have? Know them and vote in all of those elections. Hold them accountable. Or even better yet, run for office. Run for a local office. I would love that, right? And then come back and talk to us about how that went. Because it's really important to run, to challenge incumbents, to let them know you're holding them accountable and you're watching what they're doing. And they need to be doing things that are making our communities healthier and happier and more inclusive as a society. And that if they don't, you're voting them out or you're gonna be running, okay? And so that's my thing, is to play, read, and vote. And yeah, vote in all of your local elections.
Awesome. Well, this has been time well spent. I believe I really appreciate having you all here for this thoughtful conversation. We're going to wrap things up now. If you want to follow stay engaged in this conversation, it's going to be on the Harvard Chance YouTube page, and I'm sure you can find all of these people, either on social media or their emails or somewhere else. Only good emails, please. But thank you all for joining us. This has been great.
Thank you.
Awesome.